Chapter 6 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 6. San Francisco. An unexpected desertion. Captain Bunting takes a gloomy view of things in general. New friends and new plans. Singular facts and curious fancies. The Golden Gates, as they are called, of San Francisco, are two rocky headlands about a mile apart, which form the entrance to one of the finest harbours, or rather landlocked seas, in the world. This harbour is upward of 40 miles long by about 12 miles broad at its widest point, and receives at its northern end the waters of the noble Sacramento River, into which all the other rivers in California flow. Nearly opposite to the mouth of the Sacramento, on the southern shores of the bay, stands the famous city of San Francisco, close to which the Roving Bess let go her anchor and clasped the golden strand. The old adage that truth is strange, stranger than fiction, was never more forcibly verified than in the growth and career of this wonderful city. No dreams of Arabian romance ever surpassed the inconceivable wonders that were matters of everyday occurrence there during the first years of the gold fever, and many of the results attributed to Aladdin's wonderful lamp were almost literally accomplished, in some cases actually surpassed, in and around the cities of California. Before the discovery of gold, San Francisco was a mere hamlet. It consisted of a few rude cottages, built of sun-dried bricks, which were tenanted by native Californians. There were also a few merchants who trafficked in hides and horns. Cruisers and whalers occasionally put into the harbour to obtain fresh supplies of water, but beyond these and the vessels engaged in the hide trade, few ships ever visited the port, and the name of San Francisco was almost unknown. But the instant the rumour got abroad that gold had been discovered there, the eyes of the world were turned towards it. In a few months men and ships began to pour into the capacious harbour. A city of tents overspread the sand hills on which the hamlet stood. Thousands upon thousands of gold hunters rushed to the mines. The golden treasures of the land were laid bare, and immense fortunes were made, literally in the course of a few weeks. In many cases these were squandered or gambled away almost as soon as made, but hundreds of men retired from the gold fields after a few months' labour, and returned home possessed of ample fortunes. Thousands, too, failed. Some from physical inability to stand the fatiguing labour of the mines, and some from what they termed want of luck, though want of perseverance was in 9 times out of 10 the real cause, while many hundreds perished from exposure, and from the diseases that were prevalent in the country. Well would it have been for these last had they remembered God's word, "Make not haste to be rich." But the thirst for gold, and the prospect of the sudden acquisition of enormous wealth, had blinded them to the fact that their frames were not equal to the rough life at the mines. The excitement was at its height when the Roving Bess anchored off the shores of this land of gold. The sun was just setting as the anchor dropped, and the crippled ship swung round towards the shore, for the tide had just begun to rise. "Faix, it's a quare town," said Larry O'Neil to Ned, who was gazing in rapt astonishment and admiration over the stern. It was indeed quare. The entire city was made up of the most flimsy and make-shift materials that can be conceived. Many of the shops were mere tents, with an open framework of wood in front. Some were made of sheet iron nailed to wooden posts. Some were made of zinc; others, imported from the States, of wood, painted white and edged with green. A few were built of sun-dried bricks, still fewer of corrugated iron, and many of all these materials pieced together in a sort of fancy patchwork. Even boats were used as dwellings, turned keel up, with a hole cut in their sides for the egress of a tin smoke pipe, and 2 others of larger size to serve as door and window. Finding space scarce, owing to the abrupt rise of the hills from the shore, many enterprising individuals had encroached upon the sea, and built houses on piles driven into the sand nearly half a mile below the original high water mark. Almost every nation under the sun had representatives there, and the consequent confusion of tongues was equal to that of Babel. The hills overhanging the lower part of the town were also well covered with tents, temporary houses, and cottages that had some appearance of comfort about them. Such was the city on which the sun went down that night, and many were the quaint, sagacious, and comic remarks made by the men as they sat round their various mess tables in the forecastle of the Roving Bess, speculating noisily and half seriously on the possibility of getting a run into the interior for a day or two. But there was a party of men in the ship whose conversation that night was neither so light-hearted nor so loud. They sat in a dark corner of the forecastle talking earnestly in subdued tones after the watch for the night was set. Their chief spokesman was a rough, ill-looking fellow named Elliott. "You see, lads," said this man to the half-dozen comrades around him, "we must do it to-night if we're to do it at all. There's the captain's small boat layin' out astarn, which comes quite handy, and, as we lose all our pay by the dodge, I don't see why we shouldn't take it." The man struck his fist into his left palm, and looked round the circle for opinions. "I don't half like it," said one. "It seems to me a sneaking way of doing it." "Bah!" ejaculated another. "What gammon you do talk! If he lose the boat, don't we lose the tin? Besides, are we a goin' to let such a trifle stand in the way of us and our fortunes?" "Have you spoken to the other men, Elliott?" inquired one of the group. "Ay, of course I have, and they're all agreeable. Young Spence stood out pretty stiff at first, but I talked him over, only I said nothin' to Larry O'Neil or Bill Jones. I know it's of no use, they'll never agree, and if we was to speak of it to either of 'em, he'd go right away aft and tell the captain. Their watch below'll come on in an hour, and then the watch on deck'll be on our side. So, lads, go and get ready, and sharp's the word." The party broke up and went quietly below to prepare for flight, leaving no one on deck except O'Neil and Jones and two of their comrades, who formed part of the watch. As Elliott had said, the watch was changed in about an hour. The mate and captain came on deck, looked round to see that all was right, and then returned to the cabin to consult about the preliminary arrangements for disposing of the remnant of the cargo. Ned Sinton had turned in to have a good sleep before the expected toil and bustle of the following day. O'Neil and Jones, being relieved from duty, were glad to jump into their hammocks, and the deck was left in charge of the conspirators. It was a clear, lovely night. Not a zephyr stirred the surface of the sea, in whose depths the starry host and the images of 100 ships of all shapes and tonnage were faithfully mirrored. Bright lights illumined the city, those in the tents giving to them the appearance of cones and cubes of solid fire. The subdued din of thousands of human voices floated over the water, and mingled with the occasional shout or song that rose from the fleet and the splash of oars as boats passed to and from the shore. Over all, the young moon shed a pale, soft light, threw into deep shadow the hills towards the north, which rose abruptly to a height of 3000 feet, and tipped with a silver edge the peak of Mount Diavolo, whose lofty summit overlooks all the golden land between the great range of the Sierra Nevada and the ocean. It was a scene of peaceful beauty, well fitted to call forth the adoration of man to the great and good Creator. Doubtless there were some whose hearts rose that night above the sordid thoughts of gain and gold, but few such were recognisable by their fellow men compared with the numerous votaries of sin and so-called pleasure. Towards midnight, Captain Bunting turned in, ordering the steward to call him at daybreak, and shortly afterwards the mate retired, having previously looked round the deck and spoken the watch. A few minutes after, Elliott and his comrades appeared on deck, with their boots and small bundles in their hands. "Is all right?" whispered Elliott. "All right," replied one of the watch. Nothing more was said. The boat was hauled softly alongside, and held firmly there, while two men descended and muffled the oars. Then, one by one, the men slid down the side, and a bag of biscuit and a junk of beef were lowered into it by the second mate, who was one of the conspirators. At that moment the first mate came on deck, and went forward to inquire what was wrong. "It's something in the boat, sir," replied the second mate. The mate looked over the side, and the sailors felt that they must be discovered, and that their plans were about to be frustrated, but the second mate was a man of decision. He suddenly seized Williams round the neck, and, covering his mouth with his hand, held him as if in a vice until he was secured and gagged. "Shall we leave him?" whisperingly inquired one of the men. "No, he'd manage to kick up a row. Take him with us." The helpless mate was immediately passed over the side, the rope was cast off, and the boat floated softly away. At first the oars were dipped so lightly that no sound was heard, even by those on board, except the drops of brine that trickled from the blades as they rose from the water. Then, as the distance increased, the strokes were given more vigorously, and at last the men bent to it with a will, and they were soon shooting over the vast bay in the direction of the Sacramento River, up which they meant to proceed to the diggings. With the exception of O'Neil and Jones, who had already reached the diggings in their dreams, the whole crew, 16 in all, levanted, leaving Captain Bunting to navigate the ship back to Old England as he best might. It is easier to conceive than to describe the feelings of the captain when, on the following morning, he discovered that his crew had fled. He stamped and danced and tugged his hair, and pursed up his lips so tight that nothing but an occasional splutter escaped them. Then he sat down on the cabin skylight, looked steadily at Ned, who came hurriedly on deck in his shirt and drawers to see what was wrong, and burst into a prolonged fit of laughter. "Hullo, captain, what's up?" "Nothin', lad. Oh, yes, human flesh is up, Ned. Sailors is riz, and we've been sold. We have. Uncommon." Hereupon the captain roared again, but there was a slight peculiarity in the tone that indicated a strong infusion of rage with the seeming merriment. "They're all gone, every man jack," said Jones, with a face of deep solemnity, as he stood looking at the captain. "So they are, the blackguards, and that without bidding us good morning. Bad luck to them," added O'Neil. At first Ned Sinton felt little disposed to take a comic view of the affair, and urged the captain strongly to take the lightest boat and set off in pursuit; but the latter objected to this. "It's of no use," he said. "The ship can't be repaired here without heavy expense; so, as I don't mean to go to sea again for some time, the desertion of the men matters little after all." "Not go to sea again!" exclaimed Ned in surprise. "What then do you mean to do?" "That's more than I can tell. I must see first how the cargo is to be disposed of. After that, it will be time enough to concoct plans for the future. It is quite clear that the tidal luck is out about as far as it can go just now. Perhaps it may turn soon." "No doubt of it, captain," cried his young protege, with a degree of energy that shewed he had made up his mind as to what his course should be in the event of things coming to the worst. "I'll go down and put on a few more articles of clothing, and then we'll have a talk over matters." The talk, which was held over the breakfast table in the cabin, resulted in the captain resolving to go ashore, and call on a Scotch merchant named Thompson, to whom he had a letter of introduction. Half an hour later this resolve was carried out. Jones rowed them ashore in the smallest boat they had, and sculled back to the ship, leaving O'Neil with them to assist in carrying up 2 boxes which were consigned to Mr Thompson. The quay on which they stood was crowded with men of all nations, whose excited looks and tones, and go-ahead movements, testified to the high-pressure speed with which business in San Francisco was transacted. "It's more nor I can do to carry them 2 boxes at once," said Larry O'Neil, regarding them with a puzzled look; "and sorra a porter do I see nowhere." As he spoke, a tall, gentlemanly looking young man, in a red flannel shirt, round-crowned, wide-awake, long boots, and corduroys, stepped forward and said, "I'll help you if you like." "Do you think you can lift it?" inquired Larry, with a dubious look. The youth replied by seizing one of the boxes and lifting it with ease on his shoulder, showing that, though destitute of fat, he had more than the average allowance of bone and sinew. "I doubt if you could do it better than that yourself, Larry," said Ned, laughing. "Come along now, close at our heels, lest we get separated in the crowd." The young porter knew the residence of Mr Thompson well, and guided them swiftly through the crowded thoroughfares towards it. Passing completely through the town, he led them over the brow of one of the sand hills behind it, and descended into a little valley, where several neat villas were scattered along the sides of a pleasant green slope, that descended towards another part of the bay. Turning into the little garden in front of one of these villas, he placed the box on the wooden platform before the door, and said, "This is Mr Thompson's house." There was something striking in the appearance of this young porter. He seemed much above his station in life, and Ned Sinton regarded his bronzed and handsome, but somewhat haggard and dissipated countenance with interest, as he drew out his purse and asked what was to pay. $2, answered the man. Ned looked up in surprise. The idea of paying 8 shillings for so slight a service had never entered his imagination. At that moment the door opened, and Mr Thompson appeared, and invited them to enter. He was a shrewd, business-like man, with stern but kind expression of countenance. Come in, and welcome to California," he said, on perusing the captain's letter of introduction. "Glad to see you, gentlemen. You've not had breakfast, of course. We are just about to sit down. This way," he added, throwing open the door of a comfortable and elegantly furnished parlour. "Bring the boxes into the passage. That'll do. Here, Lizette, pay the men, dear. $2 apiece, I fancy." "Excuse me," interrupted Captain Bunting, "only one has to be paid. The other is one of my sailors." "Ah, very good. Which is he?" Larry O'Neil stepped forward, hat in hand. "Go in there, my man, and cook will attend to you." Larry passed through the doorway pointed out, with a pleasant, fluttering sensation at the heart, which was quickly changed to a feeling of considerable disappointment on discovering that cook was a negro. Meanwhile, Lizette took $2 from her purse, and, bowing modestly to the strangers as she passed out of the room, advanced with them towards the young porter. Now, Lizette was not beautiful. Few women are, in the highest sense of the term, and the few who are seldom interesting. But she was pretty, and sweet, and innocent, and just turned 16. Fortunately for the male part of the world, there are many such. She had light brown hair, which hung in dishevelled curls all round, a soft fair complexion, blue eyes, and a turned-up nose, a pert little nose that said plainly, "I will have my own way, now see if I don't." But the heart that animated the body to which that nose belonged was a good, kind, earnest one. Therefore the nose having its own way was rather a blessing than otherwise to those happy individuals who dwelt habitually in the sunshine of Lizette's presence. At this particular time ladies were scarce in California. The immense rush of men from all parts of the earth to the diggings had not been accompanied as yet by a corresponding rush of women. Consequently the sight of a female face was, as it always ought to be, a source of comfort to mankind. We say comfort advisedly, because life at the gold mines was a hard, riotous, mammon-seeking, rugged, and, we regret to say it, ungodly life, and men in whom the soft memories of other days were not entirely quenched had need sometimes of the comforting reflection that there still existed beings on the earth who didn't rant and roar and drink and swear and wear beards and boots and bowie knives. There was double cause, then, for the gaze of respectful admiration with which the young porter regarded Lizette, as she said, "Here is your fare, porter," and put the money into his hand, which he did not even thank her for, but continued to hold extended as if he wished her to take it back again. Lizette did not observe the gaze, for she turned away immediately after giving him the money, and re-entered the parlour, whereupon the youth thrust both hands into his breeches pockets, left the house, and returned slowly to the city, with the expression on his countenance of one who had seen a ghost. Meanwhile, Captain Bunting and Ned Sinton sat down with their host and hostess to a second breakfast, over which the former related the circumstances of the double loss of his crew and cargo. "You are unfortunate," said Mr Thompson, when the captain paused, "but there are hundreds in nearly the same predicament. Many of the fine-looking vessels you see in the harbour have lain helplessly there for months, the crews having taken French leave and gone off to the diggings." "It's awkward," said the captain, with a troubled expression, as he slowly raised a square lump of pork to his mouth. "What would you advise me to do?" "Sell off the remnant of the cargo, and set up a floating boarding house." The square lump of pork disappeared as the captain thrust it into his cheek in order to say, "What?" with a look of intense amazement. Lizette laughed inadvertently, and feeling that this was somewhat rude, she, in her effort to escape, plunged deeper into misfortune by turning to Sinton with a blushing countenance, and asking him to take another cup of tea, a proposal that was obviously absurd, seeing that she had a moment before filled up his second cup. Thus suddenly appealed to, Ned stammered, "Thank you, if you no, thank you. Not any more." "Set up a floating boarding establishment," reiterated the merchant, in a tone of decision that caused them all to laugh heartily. "It may sound strange," he continued, "but I assure you it's not a bad speculation. The captain of an American schooner, whose crew deserted the very day she arrived, turned his vessel into a floating boarding house about 2 months ago, and I believe he's making a fortune." "Indeed!" ejaculated the captain, helping himself to another mass of pork, and accepting Lizette's proffer of a third cup of tea. "You have no idea," continued the merchant, as he handed the bread to Ned, and pressed him to eat, "you have no idea of the strange state of things here just now, and the odd ways in which men make money. Owing to the rush of immigrants, everything is enormously dear, and house room is not to be had for love or money, so that, if you were to fit up your ship for the purpose, you could fill it at once. At the various hotels in the city, an ordinary meal at the table d'hôte costs from $2 to $3, 8 and 12 shillings of our money, and there are some articles that bear fabulous prices. It's a fact that eggs at this moment sell at a shilling each, and onions and potatoes at the same price. But then wages are enormously high. How long this state of things will last no one can tell. In the meantime, hundreds of men are making fortunes. Only the other day a ship arrived from New York, and one of the passengers, a cute fellow, had brought out 1,500 copies of several newspapers, which he sold for $1 each in less than 2 hours. Then rents are tremendous. You will scarcely believe me when I tell you that the rent paid by the landlord of one of the hotels here is $110,000, about £22,000 a year, and it is but a poor building, too. My own warehouse, which is a building of only 1 story, with a front of 20 feet, is rented to me at $40,000, £8,000 a year, and rents are rising." Ned and the captain leaned back in their chairs aghast at such statements, and began to entertain some doubts as to the sanity of their host. But the worthy merchant was a grave, quiet man, without a particle of romance in his composition, and he went on coolly telling them facts which Ned afterwards said made his hair almost stand on end when he thought of how little money he possessed, and how much he would have to pay for the bare necessaries of life. After some further converse on men and things in general, and on prospects at the mines, Mr Thompson said, "And now, Captain Bunting, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will go down to your ship, overhaul the cargo, and make you an offer for the whole in the lump, taking the saleable with the unsaleable. This will at any rate put you in funds at once, and enable you to follow what course seems best. Will that suit you?" "It will," said the captain, "and thank ye. As for turning a boarding house keeper, I don't think I'm cut out for it. Neither is my friend Sinton, eh?" "Certainly not," answered Ned, laughing. "We might as well become washerwomen." "You'd make a pretty good thing of it if you did," retorted Mr Thompson. "Would they not, Lizette? You know more about these things than I do." "Indeed, I cannot tell, papa, as I do not know the capabilities of our friends in that way. But I think the few washerwomen in the city must be making fortunes, for they charge 2 shillings apiece for everything, large and small." "Now then, gentlemen," said the merchant, rising, "if you have quite finished, we will walk down to the harbour and inspect the goods." An arch smile played around Lizette's lips as she shook hands with Ned at parting, and she seemed on the point of speaking, but checked herself. "I beg pardon," said Ned, pausing. "Did you "Oh, it was nothing," said Lizette. "I was only going to remark that if you set up in the washing line, I shall be happy to give you all the work I can." "Ahem!" coughed Ned gravely. "And if we should set up in the other line, will you kindly come and board with us?" "Halloo, Ned, what's keeping you?" roared the captain. "Coming!" shouted Ned, as he ran after him. "Where has Larry O'Neil gone?" "He's away down before us to have a look at the town. We shall find him, I doubt not, cruising about the quay." In a few minutes the 3 friends were wending their way through the crowded streets back to the shore. CHAPTER 7 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 7. The Fate of the Roving Bess. Gambling Scenes. Mr. Sinton makes a new friend. Larry O'Neil makes money in strange ways. A murder and a beggar's death. Ned becomes a poor man's heir. The remnant of the cargo of the Roving Bess proved to be worth comparatively little, less even than had been anticipated. After a careful inspection, Mr. Thompson offered to purchase it in the slump for $1,000, about £200 sterling. This was a heavy blow to poor Captain Bunting, who had invested his all, the savings of many years, in the present unfortunate venture. However, his was not a nature to brood over misfortunes that could not be avoided, so he accepted the sum with the best grace he might, and busied himself during the next few days in assisting the merchant to remove the bales. During this period he did not converse much with any one, but meditated seriously on the steps he ought to take. From all that he heard, it seemed impossible to procure hands to man the ship at that time, so he began to entertain serious thoughts of taking his chance at the diggings after all. He was by nature averse to this, however, and had nearly made up his mind to try to beat up recruits for the ship, when an event occurred that settled the matter for him, rather unexpectedly. This event was the bursting out of a hurricane, or brief but violent squall, which, before assistance could be procured, dragged the Roving Bess from her moorings, and stranded her upon the beach just below the town. Here was an end to seafaring prospects. The whole of his limited capital would not have paid for a 10th part of the labour necessary to refloat the ship, so he resolved to leave her on the beach and go to the diggings. Mr. Thompson advised him to sell the whole, as it would fetch a good price for the sake of the timber, which at that time was much wanted in the town, but the captain had still a lurking hope that he might get his old ship afloat at some future period, and would not hear of it. "What," said he, "sell the Roving Bess, which stands A1 at Lloyd's, to be broken up to build gold diggers' houses? I trow not. No, no, let her lie where she is in peace." On the day after the squall, as Ned and the captain were standing on the shore regarding their late floating and now grounded home in sad silence, a long-legged, lantern-jawed man, in dirty canvas trousers, long boots, a rough coat, and broad straw hat, with an enormous cigar in his mouth, and both hands in his trousers pockets, walked up and accosted them. It did not require a second glance to know that he was a Yankee. "Guess that ere's pretty well fixed up, stranger," he said, addressing the captain, and pointing with his nose to the stranded vessel. "It is," answered the captain shortly. "Fit for nothin' but firewood, I calculate." To this the captain made no reply. "I say, stranger," continued the Yankee, "I wouldn't mind to give 'ee $1,000 for her, slick off." "I don't wish to sell her," replied the captain. "Say 1,500," replied the man. "I tell you I won't sell her." "No? Now that is curious. Will 'ee loan her, then?" Here Ned whispered a few words to the captain, who nodded his head, and, turning to the Yankee, said, "How much will you give?" "Wall, I reckon she's too far out to drive a screamin' trade, but I don't mind sayin' $100 a month." After some consultation with Ned, and a little more talk with the Yankee, Captain Bunting agreed to this proposal, only stipulating that the bargain should hold good for a year, that the whole should not be cut or damaged in any way, and that the rent should be paid in advance into the hands of Mr. Thompson, as he himself was about to proceed to the gold fields. Having sealed and settled this piece of business at a neighbouring tavern, where the Yankee, Major Whitlaw, ordered a brandy smash for himself and 2 gin slings for his companions, which they civilly declined to his intense amazement, the contracting parties separated. "That's rather a sudden transfer of our good ship," said Ned, laughing, as they walked toward the plaza, or principal square of the town, where some of the chief hotels and gambling houses were situated. "I feel half sorry for having done it," replied the captain. "However, it can't be helped now, so I'll away to our friend Thompson's office and tell him about it." "Then I shall wander about here until you return. It will be dinner time at the hotels 2 hours hence. Suppose we meet at the Parker House, and talk over our future plans while we discuss a chop." To this the captain agreed, and then hurried off to his friend's office, while Ned entered the hotel. A large portion of this building was rented by gamblers who paid the enormous sum of $60,000 a year for it, and carried on their villainous and degrading occupation in it night and day. The chief games played were monte and faro, but no interest attached to the games as such. The winning or losing of money was that which lent fascination to the play. Ned had intended to stroll through the hotel and observe the various visitors who thronged the bar, but the crash of a brass band in the gambling saloons awakened his curiosity, and induced him to enter. The scene that met his eyes was, perhaps, the strangest and the saddest he had ever looked upon. The large saloon was crowded with representatives of almost every civilised nation under the sun. English, Scotch, Irish, Yankees, French, Russians, Turks, Chinese, Mexicans, Indians, Malays, Jews, and negroes, all were there in their national costumes, and all were, more or less, under the fascinating influence of the reigning vice of California, and especially of San Francisco. The jargon of excited voices can neither be conceived nor described. Crowds surrounded the monte tables, on which glittering piles of gold and silver coin were passing from hand to hand, according to varying fortune. The characteristics, and we may add the worst passions, of the various nations were ever and anon brought strongly out. The German and Spaniard laid down their money and lost or won without a symptom of emotion. The Turk stroked his beard as if with the view of keeping himself cool. The Russian looked stolid and indifferent. The Frenchman started, frowned, swore, and occasionally clutched his concealed pistol or bowie knife, while the Yankee stamped and swore. But indeed the men of all nations cursed and swore in that terrible place. Those who dwelt in the city staked gold and silver coin, while the men just returned from the mines staked gold dust and nuggets. These last were conspicuous from their rough clothing, rugged, bronzed, and weather-worn countenances. Many of them played most recklessly. Several successful diggers staked immense sums, and either doubled or lost, in 2 or 3 throws, the hard earnings of many months of toil, and left the rooms penniless. At one end of the saloon there was a counter with a plentiful supply of stimulants to feed the excitement of the wretched gamblers, and the waiter here was kept in constant employment. Ned had never been within the unhallowed precincts of a gambling house before, and it was with a feeling of almost superstitious dread that he approached the table and looked on. A tall, burly, bearded miner stepped forward at the moment, and placed a huge purse of gold dust on the table. "Now then," he cried, with a reckless air, "here goes. Neck or nothin'." "Nothin'," he muttered, with a fearful oath, as the president raked the purse into his coffers. The man rose and strode sullenly from the room, his fingers twitching nervously about the hilt of his bowie knife, an action which the president observed, but heeded not, being prepared with a concealed revolver for whatever might occur. Immediately another victim stepped forward, staked $500, and won. He staked again $1,000, and won. Then he rose, apparently resolved to tempt fickle fortune no more, and left the saloon. As he retired, his place was filled by a young man who laid down the small sum of $2. Fortune favoured this man for a long time, and his pile of dollars gradually increased, until he became over confident, and staked fully half of his gains, and lost. Ned's attention was drawn particularly to this player, whom he thought he had seen before. On looking more fixedly at him, he recognised the young porter who had carried up the box to the merchant's house. His next stake was again made recklessly. He laid down all he possessed, and lost. Then he rose suddenly, and drawing a pistol from his breast, rushed towards the door. None of the players who crowded the saloon paid him more than momentary attention. It mattered not to them whether he meditated suicide or murder. They made way for him to pass, and then, closing in, were deep again in the all-absorbing game. But our hero was not thus callous. A strong feeling of sympathy filled his breast, prompting him to spring through the doorway and catch the youth by the shoulder just as he gained the street. He turned round instantly and presented the revolver at Ned's breast, but the latter caught his right arm in his powerful grasp and held it in the air. "Be calm, my poor fellow," he said. "I mean you no harm. I only wish to have a word of conversation with you. You are an Englishman, I perceive." The young man's head fell on his breast, and he groaned aloud. come," said Ned, releasing his arm. "Don't give way like that." "I'm lost," said the youth bitterly. "I have struggled against this passion for gaming, but it has overcome me again and again. It is vain to fight against it any longer." "Not a bit of it, man," said Ned, in a cheering tone, as he drew the arm of the young man within his own, and led him slowly along the street. "You are excited just now by your disappointments. Let us walk together a while, for I have something to say to you. I am quite a stranger here, and it's a comfort to have a countryman to talk with." The kind words and earnest, hearty manner of our hero had the effect of soothing the agitated feelings of his new friend, and of winning his confidence. In the course of half an hour he drew from him a brief account of his past history. His name, he said, was Collins. He was the son of a clergyman, and had received a good education. 5 years before the period of which we now write, he had left his home in England and gone to sea, being at that time 16 years of age. For 3 years he served before the mast in a South Sea whale ship, and then returned home to find his father and mother dead. Having no near relations alive, and not a sixpence in the world, he turned once more towards the sea, with a heavy heart and an empty pocket, obtained a situation as second mate in a trading vessel which was about to proceed to the Sandwich Islands. Encountering a heavy gale on the western coast of South America, his vessel was so much disabled as to be compelled to put into the harbour of San Francisco for repairs. Here the first violent attack of the gold fever had set in. The rush of emigrants was so great that goods of all kinds were selling at fabulous prices, and the few bales that happened to be on board the ship were disposed of for 20 times their value. The captain was in ecstasies, and purposed sailing immediately to the nearest civilised port for a cargo of miscellaneous goods. But the same fate befell him which afterwards befell Captain Bunting, and many hundreds of others. The crew deserted to the mines. Thereupon the captain and young Collins also betook themselves to the gold fields, leaving the ship to swing idly at her anchor. Like most of the first arrivals at the mines, Collins was very successful, and would soon, in diggers' parlance, have made his pile, i.e. his fortune, had not scurvy attacked and almost killed him, compelling him to return to San Francisco in search of fresh vegetables and medicine, neither of which at that time could be obtained at the mines for love or money. He recovered slowly, but living in San Francisco was so expensive that, ere his health was sufficiently recruited to enable him to return to the gold fields, his funds were well nigh exhausted. In order to recruit them, he went, in an evil hour, to the gaming saloons, and soon became an inveterate gambler. In the providence of God, he had been led, some years before, to become an abstainer from all intoxicating drinks, and, remaining firm to his pledge throughout the course of his downward career, was thus saved from the rapid destruction which too frequently overtook those who to the exciting influences of gambling added the maddening stimulus of alcohol. But the constant mental fever under which he laboured was beginning to undermine a naturally robust constitution, and to unstring the nerves of a well-made, powerful frame. Sometimes, when fortune favoured him, he became suddenly possessor of a large sum of money, which he squandered in reckless gaiety. Often, however, following the dictates of an amiable, sympathetic disposition, he gave the most of it away to companions and acquaintances in distress. At other times he had not wherewith to pay for his dinner, in which case he took the first job that offered, in order to procure a few dollars. Being strong and active, he frequently went down to the quays, and offered his services as a porter to any of the gold hunters who were arriving in shoals from all parts of the world. It was thus, as we have seen, that he first met with Ned Sinton and his friends. All this, and a great deal more, did Ned worm out of his companion in the course of half an hour's stroll in the plaza. "Now," said he, when Collins had finished, "I'm going to make a proposal to you. I feel very much interested in all that you have told me. To be candid with you, I like your looks, and I like your voice. In fact, I like yourself, but what's your Christian name?" "Tom," replied the other. "Very well, then I'll call you Tom in future, and you'll call me Ned. Now, Tom, you must come with me and Captain Bunting to the gold fields, and try your fortune over again. Nay, don't shake your head. I know what you would say. You have no money to equip yourself, and you won't be indebted to strangers, and all that sort of stuff. But that won't do, my boy. I'm not a stranger. Don't I know all your history from first to last?" Tom Collins sighed. "Well, perhaps I don't know it all, but I know the most of it, and besides, I feel as if I had known you all my life." "Ned," interrupted the other, in an earnest tone of voice, "I feel your kindness very much. No one has spoken to me as you have done since I came to the diggings, but I cannot agree to your proposal to day. Meet me at the Parker House to morrow at this time, and I shall give you a final answer." "But why not give it now?" Because I want to get paid for a job I expect to get." "Tom," said Ned, stopping and laying his hand on the shoulder of his companion, while he looked earnestly into his face, "let us begin our friendship with mutual candour. Do you not intend to make a few dollars, and then try to increase them by another throw at the gaming table?" The youth's brow flushed slightly as he answered, "You're right, I had half an intention of trying my fortune for the last time." "Then," said Ned, firmly and emphatically, "you shall do nothing of the sort. Gambling for money is a mean, pitiful, contemptible thing. Don't frown, my dear fellow, I do not apply these terms to you, I apply them to the principle of gambling, a principle which you do not hold, as I know from your admission made to me not many minutes ago, that you have often striven against the temptation. Many men don't realise the full extent of the sinfulness of many of their practices, but although that renders them less culpable, it does not render them innocent, much less does it justify the evil practices. Gambling is all that I have styled it, and a great deal worse, and you must give it up. I insist on it. Moreover, Tom, I insist on your coming to dine with me at the Parker House. I shall introduce you to my friend Captain Bunting, whom you already know by sight. So come along." "Well, I will," said Tom, smiling at his friend's energy, but still hanging back, "but you must permit me to go to my lodgings first. I shall be back immediately." "Very good. Remember, we dine in the course of an hour, so be punctual." While Tom Collins hurried away to his lodgings, Ned Sinton proceeded toward the shores of the bay in a remarkably happy frame of mind, intending to pass his leisure hour in watching the thousands of interesting and amusing incidents that were perpetually taking place on the crowded quays, where the passengers from the newly arrived brig were looking in bewildered anxiety after their luggage and calling for porters, where traffic, by means of boats, between the fleet and the land, created constant confusion and hubbub, where men of all nations bargained for the goods of all climes in every known tongue. While he gazed in silence at the exciting and almost bewildering scene, his attention was attracted to a group of men, among whose vociferating tones he thought he distinguished familiar voices. "That's it, here's your man, sir," cried one, bursting from the crowd, with a huge portmanteau on his shoulder. "Now then, where'll I steer to?" "Right ahead, to the best hotel," answered a slim Yankee, whose black coat, patent leather boots, and white kids in such a place told plainly enough that a superfine dandy had mistaken his calling. "Ay, ay, sir," shouted Bill Jones, as he brushed past Ned in his new capacity of porter. "Faix, you've cotched a live Yankee!" exclaimed a voice there was no mistaking, as the owner slapped Bill on the shoulder. "He'll make yer fortin, av ye only stick by him. He's just cut out for the diggin's. Av his mother was here to take care of him." Larry O'Neil gave a chuckle, slapped his pockets, and cut an elephantine caper as he turned from contemplating the retreating figure of his shipmate's employer, and advanced toward the end of the quay. "Now then, who's nixt?" cried he, holding out both arms, and looking excited, as if he were ready to carry off any individual bodily in his arms to any place, for mere love, without reference to money. "Don't all spake at once. $2 a mile for anything under a ton, and yourself on the top of it for 4. Hurroo, Mr Sinton, darlint, is it yourself? Och, but this is the place entirely. Gold and silver for the axin' a'most. Ah, ye needn't grin. Look here." Larry plunged both hands into the pockets of his trousers, and pulled them forth full of half and quarter dollars, with a few shining little nuggets of gold interspersed among them. Ned opened his eyes in amazement, and, taking his excited comrade apart from the crowd, asked how he had come by so much money. "Come by it!" he exclaimed. "You could come by twice the sum if you liked. Sure, didn't I find that they was chargin' $2, equal to 8 shillin's, I'm told, for carryin' a box or portmanteau the length o' me foot. So I turns porter all at once, and faix, I made $6 in less nor an hour. But as I was comin' back, I says to myself, says I, `Larry, you'll be the better of a small glass or something, eh?' So in I goes to a grog shop, and faix, I had to pay $half for a thimbleful o' brandy. Bad luck to them, as would turn the stomach o' a pig. I almost had a round with the landlord, but they told me it was the same everywhere, so I went and had another in the next shop, I says, just to try, and it was true. Then a Yankee spies my knife, the great pig sticker that Bob Short swapped with me for me junk o' plum duff off the Cape. It seems they've run out o' sich articles just at this time, and would give handfuls o' gold for one. So says I, `What'll you give?' $3, I guess, says one. `4,' says another. `He's cheatin' you.' `4's bid,' says I, mountin' on a keg o' baccy and houldin' up the knife. `Who says more? It's the raal stale, straight from Manchester or Connaught, I misremember which. Warranted to cut both ways, if you only turn the edge round, and shove with a will.' I be good in joke, but faix, they took me up in arnest, and run up the price to $20. £4, as sure as me name's Larry, before I knowed where I was. I believe I could have got 40 for it, but I hadn't the heart to ax more, for it wasn't worth a brass button." "You've made a most successful beginning, Larry. Have you any more knives like that one?" "Sorrow o' one, more's the pity. But that's only a small bit o' me speculations. I found 6 old newspapers at the bottom o' me chest, and would you believe it, I sold 'em ivery one for $half the pace, and I don't rightly know how much clear gold I've got by standing all morning at the post office." "Standing at the post office? What do you mean?" "Nother more nor less nor what I say. I suppose you know the mails comed in yisterday morning, so says I to myself this morning, you've got no living soul in the old country that's likely to write to you, but you better go for all that and ax if there's letters. Maybe there is, who knows? So away I went, and sure enough I found a row o' men waitin' for their letters, so I crushes for'ard. Och, but I thought they'd ha' hung me on the spot, and I found it was a row that first come first served, fair play and no favour. They was all standin' one behind another in a line half a mile long if it was a foot, as patient as could be, some readin' the newspapers and some drinkin' coffee and tay and grog that was sold by men as went up and down the line the whole morning. So away I goes to the end o' the line and took me place, detarmined to stand it out, and in 3 minutes I had a tail of a dozen men behind me. Faix, Larry, says I, it's the first time you iver commenced at the end of a thing in order to git to the beginning. Well, when I was gettin' pretty near the post office windy, I hears the chap behind me a sayin' to the fellow behind him that he expected no letters, but only took up his place in the line to sell it to them what did. And sure enough I found that lots of them were on the same errand. Just then up comes a miner, in big boots and a wide awake. "Och," says he, "who'll sell me a place?" and with that he offered a lot of pure gold lumps. "Guess it's too little," says the man next me. "Oh, you thievin' blackguard," says I. "Here, yer honour, I'll sell you my place for half the lot. I can wait for me letter, more be token I'm not sure there is one. For you see I was riled at the Yankee's greed. So out I steps, and in steps the miner, and hands me the whole he'd offered at first. "Take them, my man," says he. "You're an honest feller, and it's a treat to meet one here." "Capital!" cried Ned, laughing heartily. "And you didn't try for a letter after all?" "Porter there?" shouted a voice from the quay. "That's me, yer honour. Here you are," replied the Irishman, bounding away with a yell, and shouldering a huge leathern trunk, with which he vanished from the scene, leaving Ned to pursue the train of thought evoked by his account of his remarkable experiences. We deem it necessary here to assure the reader that the account given by Larry O'Neil of his doings was by no means exaggerated. The state of society, and the eccentricities of traffic displayed in San Francisco and other Californian cities during the first years of the gold fever, beggars all description. Writers on that place and period find difficulty in selecting words and inventing similes in order to convey anything like an adequate idea of their meaning. Even eye witnesses found it almost impossible to believe the truth of what they heard and saw, and some have described the whole circle of life and manners there to have been more like to the wild, incongruous whirl of a pantomime than to the facts of real life. Even in the close and abrupt juxtaposition of the ludicrous and the horrible this held good. Ned Sinton had scarcely parted from his hilarious shipmate when he was attracted by shouts as if of men quarrelling in a gaming house, and a few moments later the report of a pistol was heard, followed by a sharp cry of agony. Rushing into the house, and forcing his way through the crowd, he reached the table in time to see the bloody corpse of a man carried out. This unfortunate had repeatedly lost large sums of money, and, growing desperate, staked his all on a final chance. He lost, and, drawing his bowie knife in the heat of despair, rushed at the president of the table. A dozen arms arrested him, and rendered his intended assault abortive. Nevertheless, the president coolly drew a revolver from under the cloth, and shot him dead. For a few minutes there was some attempt at disturbance, and some condemned, while others justified the act. But the body was removed, and soon the game went on as if nothing had occurred. Sickened with the sight, Ned hurried from the house, and walked rapidly towards the shores of the bay, beyond the limits of the canvas town, where he could breathe the free ocean air, and wander on the sands in comparative solitude. The last straggling tent in that quarter was soon behind him, and he stopped by the side of an old upturned boat, against which he leaned, and gazed out upon the crowded bay with saddened feelings. As he stood in contemplation, he became aware of a sound, as if of heaving, plethoric breathing under the boat. Starting up, he listened intently, and heard a faint groan. He now observed what had escaped his notice before, that the boat against which he leaned was a human habitation. A small hole near the keel admitted light, and possibly at times emitted smoke. Hastening round to the other side, he discovered a small aperture which served as a doorway. It was covered with a rag of coarse canvas, which he lifted and looked in. "Who's there?" inquired a voice, as sharply as extreme weakness would allow. "Have a care. There's a revolver pointing at your head. If you come in without leave, I'll blow out your brains." "I am a friend," said Ned, looking towards the further end of the boat, where, on a couch of straw, lay the emaciated form of a middle-aged man. "Put down your pistol, friend. My presence here is simply owing to the fact that I heard you groan, and I would relieve your distress if it is in my power." "You are the first that has said so since I laid down here," sighed the man, falling back heavily. Ned entered, and, advancing as well as he could in a stooping posture, sat down beside the sick man's pallet and felt his pulse. Then he looked anxiously in his face, on which the hand of death was visibly placed. "My poor fellow," said Ned in a soothing tone, "you are very ill, I fear. Have you no one to look after you?" "Ill!" replied the sick man, almost fiercely. "I am dying. I have seen death too often, and know it too well to be mistaken." His voice sank to a whisper as he added, "It is not far off now." For a few seconds Ned could not make up his mind what to say. He felt unwilling to disturb the last moments of the man. At last he leaned forward and repeated from memory several of the most consoling passages of Scripture. Twice over he said, "Though thy sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as wool," and "Him that cometh unto me, Christ, I will in no wise cast out." The man appeared to listen, but made no reply. Suddenly he started up, and, leaning on his elbow, looked with an awfully earnest stare into Ned's face. "Young man, gold is good. Gold is good. Remember that. If you don't make it your God." After a pause he continued, "I made it my God. I toiled for it night and day. In heat and cold, wet and dry, I gave up everything for it. I spent all my time in search of it, and I got it. And what good can it do me now? I have spent night and day here for weeks, threatening to shoot any one who should come near my gold. Ha!" he added sharply, observing that his visitor glanced around the apartment, "you'll not find it here. No, look round, peer into every corner, tear up every plank of my boat, and you'll find nothing but rotten wood and dust and rusty nails." "Be calm, my friend," said Ned, who now believed that the poor man's mind was wandering. "I don't want your gold. I wish to comfort you if I can. Would you like me to do anything for you after I'm dead?" said the man abruptly. "No, nothing. I have no relations, no friends, no enemies even now. Yes," he added quickly, "I have one friend. You are my friend. You have spoken kindly to me, a beggar. You deserve the name of friend. Listen, I want you to be my heir. See here, I have had my will drawn up long ago, with the place for the name left blank I had intended. But no matter. What is your name?" "Edward Sinton." "Here, hand me that inkhorn and the pen. There," continued the man, pushing the paper towards him, "I have made over to you the old boat and the ground it lies on. Both are mine. The piece of ground is marked off by 4 posts. Take care of the man's voice sank to a mere whisper. Then it ceased suddenly. When Ned looked at him again, he started, for the cold hand of death had sealed his lips for ever. A feeling of deep, intense pity filled the youth's heart, as he gazed on the emaciated form of this friendless man. Yet he experienced a sensation approaching almost to gladness when he remembered that the last words he had spoken to him were those of our blessed Saviour to the chief of sinners. Spreading the ragged piece of canvas that formed a quilt over the dead man's face, he rose and left the strange dwelling, the entrance to which he secured, and then hastened to give information of the death to the proper authorities. Ned was an hour too late for dinner when he arrived at the hotel, where he found Captain Bunting and his new friend awaiting him in some anxiety. Hastily informing them of the cause of his detention, he introduced them to each other, and forgot for a time the scene of death he had just witnessed, in talking over plans for the future, and in making arrangements for a trip to the diggings. Chapter 7. Of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 8. Our hero and his friends start for the diggings. The captain's portrait. Costumes and scenery and surprises. The ranch by the roadside. Strange travellers. They meet with a new friend and adopt him. The hunter's story. Larry offers to fight a Yankee. High prices and empty purses. Ovid never accomplished a metamorphosis more striking or complete than that effected by Captain Bunting upon his own proper person. We have said elsewhere that the worthy captain was a big, broad man, with a shaggy head of hair and red whiskers. Moreover, when he landed in San Francisco, he wore a blue coat with clear brass buttons, blue vest, blue trousers, and a glazed straw hat. But in the course of a week he effected such a change in his outward man that his most intimate friend would have failed to recognise him. No brigand of the Pyrenees ever looked more savage. No robber of the stage ever appeared more outrageously fierce. We do not mean to say that Captain Bunting got himself up for the purpose of making himself conspicuous. He merely donned the usual habiliments of a miner. But these habiliments were curious, and the captain's figure in them was unusually remarkable. In order that the reader may have a satisfactory view of the captain, we will change the scene, and proceed at once to that part of the road to the gold fields which has now been reached by our adventurers. It is a wide plain, or prairie, on which the grass waves like the waters of the sea. On one side it meets the horizon, on another it is bounded by the faint and far distant range of the Sierra Nevada. Thousands of millions of beautiful wild flowers spangle and beautify the soft green carpet, over which spreads a cloudless sky, not a whit less blue and soft than the vaunted sky of Italy. Herds of deer are grazing over the vast plain like tame cattle. Wild geese and other waterfowl wing their way through the soft atmosphere, and little birds twitter joyously among the flowers. Everything is bright and green and beautiful, for it is spring, and the sun has not yet scorched the grass to a russet brown, and parched and cracked the thirsty ground, and banished animal and vegetable life away, as it will yet do, ere the hot summer of those regions is past and gone. There is but one tree in all that vast plain. It is a sturdy oak, and near it bubbles a cool, refreshing spring, over which one could fancy it had been appointed guardian. The spot is hundreds of miles from San Francisco, on the road to the gold mines of California. Beneath that solitary oak a party of weary travellers have halted, to rest and refresh themselves and their animals, or, as the diggers have it, to take their nooning. In the midst of that party sits our captain, on the back of a long-legged mule. On his head is, or rather was, for he has just removed it in order to wipe the perspiration from his forehead, a brown felt wide awake, very much battered in appearance, suggesting the idea that the captain had used it constantly as a nightcap, which, indeed, is the fact. Nothing but a flannel shirt of the brightest possible scarlet clothes the upper portion of his burly frame, while brown corduroys adorn the lower. Boots of the most ponderous dimensions engulf not only his feet but his entire legs, leaving only a small part of the corduroys visible. On his heels, or rather just above his heels, are strapped a pair of enormous Mexican spurs, with the frightful prongs of which he so lacerated the sides of his unfortunate mule during the first part of the journey as to drive that animal frantic, and cause it to throw him off at least 6 times a day. Dire necessity has now, however, taught the captain that most difficult and rarely accomplished feat of horsemanship, to ride with the toes well in and the heels well out. Round Captain Bunting's waist is a belt, which is of itself quite a study. It is made of tough cowhide, full 2½ inches broad, and is fastened by a brass buckle that would cause the mouth of a robber chief to water. Attached to it, in various ways and places, are the following articles: a bowie knife of the largest size, not far short of a small cutlass; a pair of revolving pistols, also large and having 6 barrels each; a stout leathern purse; and a leathern bag of larger dimensions for miscellaneous articles. As the captain has given up shaving for many weeks past, little of his face is visible, except the nose, eyes, and forehead. All besides is a rugged mass of red hair, which rough travel has rendered an indescribable and irreclaimable waste. But the captain cares not. As long as he can clear a passage through the brushwood to his mouth, he says, his mind is easy. Such is Captain Bunting, and such, with but trifling modifications, is every member of his party. On Ned Sinton and his almost equally stalwart and handsome friend, Tom Collins, the picturesque costume of the miner sits well, and it gives a truly wild, dashing look to the whole party, as they stand beneath the shade of that lovely oak, preparing to refresh themselves with biscuit and jerked beef, and pipes of esteemed tobacco. Besides those we have mentioned, Larry O'Neil is there, busy carrying water in a bucket to the horses, and as proud of his Mexican spurs as if they were the golden spurs of the days of chivalry. Bill Jones is there, with a blue instead of a red flannel shirt, and coarse canvas ducks in place of corduroys. Bill affects the sailor in other respects, for he scorns heavy boots, and wears shoes and a straw hat, but he is compelled to wear the spurs, for reasons best known to his intensely obstinate mule. There is also among them a native Californian, a vaquero, or herd, who has been hired to accompany the party to the diggings, to look after the pack mules, of which there are 2, and to assist them generally, with advice and otherwise. He is a fine athletic fellow, Spanish-like, both in appearance and costume, and, in addition to bad Spanish, he gives utterance to a few sounds which he calls "English." The upper part of his person is covered by the serape, or Mexican cloak, which is simply a blanket with a hole in its centre, through which the head of the wearer is thrust, the rest being left to fall over the shoulders. Our travellers had reached the spot on which we now find them by means of a boat voyage of more than 100 miles, partly over the great bay of San Francisco, and partly up the Sacramento river, until they reached the city of Sacramento. Here they purchased mules and provisions for the overland journey to the mines, a further distance of about 150 miles, and also the picks, shovels, axes, pewter plates, spoons, pans, and pannikins, and other implements and utensils that were necessary for a campaign among the golden mountains of the Sierra Nevada. For these the prices demanded were so enormous that when all was ready for a start they had only a few dollars left amongst them. But, being on their way to dig for gold, they felt little concern on this head. As the Indians of the interior had committed several murders a short time before, and had come at various times into collision with the gold diggers, it was deemed prudent to expend a considerable sum on arms and ammunition. Each man, therefore, was armed with a rifle or carbine, a pistol of some sort, and a large knife or short sword. Captain Bunting selected a huge old bell-mouthed blunderbuss, having, as he said, a strong partiality for the weapons of his forefathers. Among other things, Ned, by advice of Tom Collins, purchased a few simple medicines. He also laid in a stock of drawing paper, pencils, and water colours for his own special use, for which he paid so large a sum that he was ashamed to tell it to his comrades. But he was resolved not to lose the opportunity of representing life and scenery at the diggings, for the sake of old Mr Shirley, as well as for his own satisfaction. Thus equipped, they set forth. Before leaving San Francisco, the captain and Ned and Tom Collins had paid a final visit to their friend the merchant, Mr Thompson, and committed their property to his care, i.e. the whole of the good ship Roving Bess, the rent of which he promised to collect monthly, and Ned's curious property, the old boat and the little patch of barren sand on which it stood. The boat itself he made over temporarily to a poor Irishman, who had brought out his wife with him, and was unable to proceed to the diggings in consequence of the said wife having fallen into a delicate state of health. He gave the man a written paper empowering him to keep possession until his return, and refused to accept of any rent, whereat the poor woman thanked him earnestly, with the tears running down her pale cheeks. It was the hottest part of an exceedingly hot day when the travellers found themselves, as we have described, under the grateful shade of what Larry termed the lone oak. "Now our course of proceeding is as follows," said Ned at the conclusion of their meal. "We shall travel all this afternoon, and as far into the night as the mules can be made to go. By that time we shall be pretty well off the level ground, and be almost within hail of the diggings." "I don't belave it," said Larry O'Neil, knocking the ashes out of his pipe in an emphatic manner. "Sure, if there was gold in the country we might have said it by this time." Larry's feelings were a verification of the words, "Hope deferred maketh the heart sick." He had started enthusiastically many days before on this journey to the gold regions, under the full conviction that on the first or second day he would be, as he expressed it, "riding through fields of gold dust," instead of which, day after day passed, and night after night, during which he endured all the agonies inseparable from a first journey on horseback, and still not a symptom of gold was to be seen, "no more nor in old Ireland itself." But Larry bore his disappointments like an Irishman, and defied "fortin to put him out of temper by any manes whatever." "Patience," said Bill Jones, removing his pipe to make room for the remark, "is a virtue, that's what I says. If you can't make things better, what then? Why, let 'em alone. When there's no wind, crowd all canvas and catch what there is. When there is wind, why then steer your course; or, if you can't, steer as near it as you can. Anyhow, never back your fore topsail without a cause. Them's my sentiments." "And very good sentiments they are, Bill," said Tom Collins, jumping up and examining the girth of his horse. "I strongly advise you to adopt them, Larry." "What a bottle o' wisdom it is!" said O'Neil, with a look of affected contempt at his messmate. "Was it your grandmother, now, or your great one, that edicated you? Ah, there you go! Oh, mother, you'll break me heart." The latter part of this remark was addressed to his mule, which at that moment broke its lariat, and gambolled gaily away over the flowering plain. Its owner followed, yelling like a madman. He might as well have chased the wind, and it is probable that he would never have mounted his steed again, had not the vaquero come to his aid. This man, leaping on his own horse, which was a very fine one, dashed after the runaway, with which he came up in a few minutes. Then, grasping the long coil of line that hung at his saddle bow, he swung it round once or twice, and threw the lasso, or noose, adroitly over the mule's head, and brought it up. "You're a cliver fella," said Larry, as they came up panting. "Sure, ye did it by chance." The man smiled, and without deigning a reply, rode back to the camp, where the party were already in the saddle. In a few minutes they were trotting rapidly over the prairie. Before evening closed, the travellers arrived at one of the roadside inns, or, as they were named, ranches, which were beginning at this time to spring up in various parts of the country, for the accommodation of gold hunters on their way to the mines. This ranche belonged to a man by the name of Dawson, who had made a few $100 by digging, and then set up a grog shop and house of entertainment, being wise enough to perceive that he could gain twice as much gold by supplying the diggers with the necessaries of life than he could hope to procure by digging. His ranche was a mere hovel, built of sun-dried bricks, and he dealt more in drinks than in edibles. The accommodation and provisions were of the poorest description, but, as there was no other house of entertainment near, mine host charged the highest possible prices. There was but one apartment in this establishment, and little or no furniture. Several kegs and barrels supported two long pine planks, which constituted, at different periods of the day, the counter, the gaming table, and the table d'hote. A large cooking stove stood in the centre of the house, but there were no chairs. Guests were expected to sit on boxes and empty casks, or stand. Beds there were none. When the hour for rest arrived, each guest chose the portion of the earthen floor that suited him best, and, spreading out his blankets, with his saddle for a pillow, lay down to dream of golden nuggets, or perchance of home, while innumerable rats, the bane of California, gambolled round and over him. The ranchero, as the owner of such an establishment is named, was said to be an escaped felon. Certainly he might have been, as far as his looks went. He was surly and morose, but men minded this little so long as he supplied their wants. There were 5 or 6 travellers in the ranche when our party arrived, all of whom were awaiting the preparation of supper. "Here we are," cried the captain, as they trotted into the yard, "ready for supper, I trow, and, if my nose don't deceive me, supper's about ready for us." "I hope they've got enough for us all," said Ned, glancing at the party inside, as he leaped from the saddle, and threw the bridle to his vaquero. "Halloo, Boniface! Have you room for a large party in there?" "Come in and see," growled Dawson, whose duties at the cooking stove rendered him indifferent as to other matters. "Ah, then, you've got a sweet voice," said Larry O'Neil, sarcastically, as he led his mule towards a post to which Bill Jones was already fastening his steed. "I say, Bill," he added, pointing to a little tin bowl which stood on an inverted cask outside the door of the ranche, "what can that be for?" "Dunno," answered Bill. "S'pose it's to wash in." At that moment a long, cadaverous miner came out of the hut, and rendered further speculation unnecessary by turning up his shirt sleeves to the elbow, and commencing his ablutions in the little tin bowl, which was just large enough to admit both his hands at once. "Faix, yer mouth and nose ought to be grateful," said Larry, in an undertone, as he and Jones stood with their arms crossed, admiring the proceedings of the man. This remark had reference to the fact that the washer applied the water to the favoured regions around his nose and mouth, but carefully avoided trespassing on any part of the territory lying beyond. "Oh, mother, what next?" exclaimed Larry. Well might he inquire, for this man, having combed his hair with a public comb, which was attached to the door post by a string, and examined himself carefully in a bit of glass about 2 inches in diameter, proceeded to cleanse his teeth with a public toothbrush which hung beside the comb. All these articles had been similarly used by a miner 10 minutes previously, and while this one was engaged with his toilet, Another man stood beside him, awaiting his turn. "When you're in difficulties," remarked Bill Jones slowly, as he entered the ranche and proceeded to fill his pipe, "get out of 'em if you can. If you can't, why, what then? Circumstances is adverse, and it's no use a tryin' to mend 'em. Only my sentiments is, that I'll delay washin' till I comes to a river." "You've come from San Francisco, stranger?" said a rough looking man in heavy boots and a Guernsey shirt, addressing Captain Bunting. "Maybe I have," replied the captain, regarding his interrogator through the smoke of his pipe, which he was in the act of lighting. "Goin' to the diggings, I suppose?" "Yes." "Been there before?" "No." "Nor none o' your party, I expect?" "None except one." "You'll be goin' up to the bar at the American Forks now, I calc'late?" "Don't know that I am." "P'r'aps you'll try the northern diggin's?" "P'r'aps." How long this pertinacious questioner might have continued his attack on the captain is uncertain, had he not been suddenly interrupted by the announcement that supper was ready, so he swaggered off to the corner of the hut, where an imposing row of bottles stood, demanded a brandy smash, which he drank, and then, seating himself at the table along with the rest of the party, proceeded to help himself largely to all that was within his reach. The fare was substantial, but not attractive. It consisted of a large junk of boiled salt beef, a mass of rancid pork, and a tray of broken ship biscuit. But hungry men are not particular, so the viands were demolished in a remarkably short space of time. "I'm almost out of supplies," said the host, in a sort of apologetic tone, "and the cart I sent down to Sacramento some weeks ago for more's not come back." "Better than nothin'," remarked a bronzed, weather beaten hunter, as he helped himself to another junk of pork. "If you would send out your boy into the hills with a rifle now and again, you'd get lots of grizzly bars." "Are grizzly bears eaten here?" inquired Ned Sinton, pausing in the act of mastication to ask the question. "Eaten!" exclaimed the hunter, in surprise. "Of course they is. They're uncommon good eatin', too, I guess. Many a one I've killed and eaten myself, and I like 'em better'n beef. I do. I shot one up in the hills there 2 days agone, and supped off him, but bein' in a hurry, I left the carcass to the coyotes." Coyotes are small wolves. The men assembled around the rude table d'hote were 15 in number, including our adventurers, and represented at least 6 different nations English, Scotch, Irish, German, Yankee, and Chinese. Most of them, however, were Yankees, and all were gold diggers. Even the hunter just referred to, although he had not altogether forsaken his former calling, devoted much of his time to searching for gold. Some, like our friends, were on their way to the diggings for the first time. Others were returning with provisions, which they had travelled to Sacramento City to purchase, and 1 or 2 were successful diggers who had made their "piles," in other words, their fortunes, and were returning home with heavy purses of gold dust and nuggets. Good humour was the prevailing characteristic of the party, for each man was either successful or sanguinely hopeful, and all seemed to be affected by a sort of undercurrent of excitement as they listened to or related their adventures at the mines. There was only one serious drawback to the scene, and that was the perpetual and terrible swearing that mingled with the conversation. The Americans excelled in this wicked practice. They seemed to labour to invent oaths, not for the purpose of venting angry feelings, but apparently with the view of giving emphasis to their statements and assertions. The others swore from habit. They had evidently ceased to be aware that they were using oaths, so terribly had familiarity with sinful practices blunted the consciences of men who, in early life, would probably have trembled in this way to break the law of God. Yes, by the way, there was one other drawback to the otherwise picturesque and interesting group, and this was the spitting propensity of the Yankees. All over the floor, that floor, too, on which other men besides themselves were to repose, they discharged tobacco juice and spittle. The nation cannot be too severely blamed and pitied for this disgusting practice, yet we feel a tendency, not to excuse, but to deal gently with individuals, most of whom, having been trained to spitting from their infancy, cannot be expected even to understand the abhorrence with which this practice is regarded by men of other nations. Nevertheless, brother Jonathan, it is not too much to expect that you ought to respect the universal condemnation of your spitting propensities by travellers from all lands, and endeavour to believe that ejecting saliva promiscuously is a dirty practice, even though you cannot feel it. We think that if you had the moral courage to pass a law in Congress to render spitting on floors and carpets a capital offence, you would fill the world with admiration, and your own bosoms with self-respect, not to mention the benefit that would accrue to your digestive powers in consequence thereof." All of the supper party were clad and armed in the rough and ready style already referred to, and most of them were men of the lower ranks, but there were one or two who, like Ned Sinton, had left a more polished class of mortals to mingle in the promiscuous crowd. These, in some cases, carried their manners with them, and exerted a modifying influence on all around. One young American, in particular, named Maxton, soon attracted general attention by the immense fund of information he possessed, and the urbane, gentlemanly manner in which he conveyed it to those around him. He possessed in an eminent degree those qualities which attract men at once, an irresistibly good nature, frankness, manliness, considerable knowledge of almost every subject that can be broached in general conversation, united with genuine modesty. When he sat down to table he did not grasp everything within his reach. He began by offering to carve and help others, and when at length he did begin to eat, he did not gobble. He guessed a little, it is true, and calculated occasionally, but when he did so, it was in a tone that fell almost as pleasantly on the ear as the brogue of old Ireland. Ned happened to be seated beside Maxton, and held a good deal of conversation with him. "Forgive me if I appear inquisitive," said the former, helping himself to a handful of broken biscuit, "but I cannot help expressing a hope that our routes may lie in the same direction. Are you travelling towards Sacramento City or the mines?" "Towards the mines; and as I observed that your party came from the southward, I suppose you are going in the same direction. If so, I shall be delighted to join you." "That's capital," replied Ned. "We shall be the better of having our party strengthened, and I am quite certain we could not have a more agreeable addition to it." "Thank you for the compliment. As to the advantage of a strong party, I feel it a safeguard as well as a privilege to join yours, for, to say truth, the roads are not safe just now. Several lawless scoundrels have been roving about in this part of the country, committing robberies and even murder. The Indians, too, are not so friendly as one could wish. They have been treated badly by some of the unprincipled miners, and their custom is to kill 2 whites for every red man that falls. They are not particular as to whom they kill, consequently the innocent are frequently punished for the guilty." "This is sad," replied Ned. "Are then all the Indian tribes at enmity with the white man?" "By no means. Many tribes are friendly, but some have been so severely handled that they have vowed revenge, and take it whenever they can with safety. Their only weapons, however, are bows and arrows, so that a few resolute white men with rifles can stand against 100 of them, and they know this well. I spent the whole of last winter on the Yuba River, and although large bands were in my neighbourhood, they never ventured to attack us openly, but they succeeded in murdering 1 or 2 miners who strayed into the woods alone." "And are these murders passed over without any attempt to bring the murderers to justice?" "I guess they are not," replied Maxton, smiling, "but justice is strangely administered in these parts. Judge Lynch usually presides, and he is a stern fellow to deal with. If you listen to what the hunter there is saying just now, you will hear a case in point, if I mistake not." As Maxton spoke, a loud laugh burst from the men at the other end of the table. "How did it happen?" cried several. "Out with the yarn, old boy." "Ay, and don't spin it too tight, or faix you'll burst the strands," cried Larry O'Neil, who, during the last half hour, had been listening open mouthed to the marvellous anecdotes of grizzlies and redskins with which the hunter entertained his audience. "Well, boys, it happened this ways," began the man, tossing off a gin sling, and setting down the glass with a violence that nearly smashed it. You see, I was up in the mountains near the headwaters of the Sacramento, lookin' out for deer, and gettin' a bit of gold now and again, when one day, as I was a-comin' down a gully in the hills, I comes all of a sudden on two men. One was an Injun, as ugly a sinner as ever I seed. T'other was a Yankee lad in a hole diggin' gold. Before my two eyes were well on 'em, the red villain lets fly an arrow, and the man fell down with a loud yell into the hole. Up goes my rifle like wink, and the redskin would ha' gone under in another second, but my piece snapped. 'Cause why? The primin' had got damp, and before I could prime again he was gone. I went up to the poor critter, and sure enough it was all up with him. The arrow went in at the back of his neck. He niver spoke again. So I laid him in the grave he had dug for himself, and set off to tell the camp, and a most tremendous row the news made. They got 50 volunteers in no time, and went off hot foot to scalp the whole nation. As I had other business to look after, and there seemed more than enough of fighting men, I left 'em and went my way. 2 days after, I had occasion to go back to the same place, and when I comed in sight of the camp, I guess there was a mighty stir. "What's to do?" says I to a miner in a hole who was diggin' away for gold and carin' nothin' about it. "Only Scragg and an Injun," he said, looking up. "Oh," says "I'll go and see." So off I set, and there was a crowd of about 200 miners round a tree, and just as I come up, they was puttin' the rope round the neck of a poor wretch of an old grey-haired redskin, whose limbs trembled so that they was scarce able to hold him up. "Heave away now, Bill," cried the man as tied the noose. But somethin' was wrong with the hitch of the rope round the branch of the tree, and it wouldn't draw, and some time was spent in puttin' it right. I felt sorter sorry for the old man, for his grey face was bold enough, and age more than fear had to do with the tremblin' of his legs. Before they got it right again, my eye fell on a small band of redskins who were looking quietly on, and foremost among 'em was the very blackguard as shot the man in the galley. I knew him at once by his ugly face. Without sayin' a word, I steps for'ard to the old Injun and takes the noose off his neck. "Hello!" cried a dozen men, jumpin' at me. "What's that for?" "Scragg the hunter," cries one. "Hold your long tongues and hear what he's got to say," shouts an Irishman. "Keep your minds easy," says I, mountin' a stump, "and seize that Injun, or I have to put a ball into him before he gets off." For, you see, I observed the black villain took fright, and was sneakin' away through the crowd. They had no doubt who I meant, for I pinted straight at him, and before you could wink he was gripped and led under the tree, with a face paler than ever I saw the face of a redskin before. "Now," says I, "what for are you scragging this old man?" So they told me how the party that went off to get the murderer met a band of Injuns comin' to deliver him up to be killed, they said, for murderin' the white man, and they gave up this old Injun, sayin' he was the murderer. The diggers believed it, and returned with the old boy and 2 or 3 others that came to see him fixed off. "Very good," says I. "You don't seem to remember that I'm the man what saw the murder, and told you of it. By good luck I've come in time to point him out, and this is him." And with that I put the noose round the villain's neck, and drawed it tight. At that he made a great start to shake it off and clear away, but before you could wink he was swinging at the branch of the tree, 20 feet in the air. "Sarved him right," cried several of the men emphatically, as the hunter concluded his anecdote. "Ay," he continued, "and they strung up his 6 friends beside him." "Served 'em right, too," remarked the tall man, whose partiality for the tin wash-hand basin and the toothbrush we have already noticed. "If I had my way, I'd shoot 'em all off the face of the earth, I would, right away." "I'm sorry to hear they did that," remarked Larry O'Neil, looking pointedly at the last speaker, "for it only shewed they was greater murderers nor the Indians. The redskins murdered 1 man, but the diggers murdered 6." "And who are you that finds fault with the diggers?" inquired the tall man, turning full round upon the Irishman with a tremendous oath. "Be the mortial," cried the Irishman, starting up like a jack-in-the-box, and throwing off his coat. "I'm Larry O'Neil at your service. Hurrah, come on, if you want to be portally worked off." Instantly the man's hand was on the hilt of his revolver, but before he could draw it, the rest of the company started up and overpowered the belligerents. "Come, gentlemen," said the host of the ranch, stepping forward, "it's not worth while quarrelling about a miserable redskin." "Put on your coat, Larry, and come, let's get ready for a start," said Ned. "You can't afford to fight till you've made your fortune at the diggings. How far is it to the next ranch, landlord?" This cool attempt to turn the conversation was happily successful. The next ranch, he was told, was about 10 miles distant, and the road comparatively easy; so, as it was a fine moonlight night, and he was desirous of reaching the first diggings on the following day as early as possible, the horses and mules were saddled, and the bill called for. When the said bill was presented, or rather announced to them, our travellers opened their eyes pretty wide. They had to open their purses pretty wide too, and empty them to such an extent that there was not more than $1 left among them all. The supper, which we have described, cost them $2.50, about 10 shillings and 6 pence a head, including a glass of bad brandy, but not including a bottle of stout which Larry, in the ignorance and innocence of his heart, had asked for, and which cost him $3 extra. An egg also, which Ned had obtained, cost him a shilling. "Oh, mother!" exclaimed Larry, "why didn't you tell us the price before we took 'em?" "Why didn't you ax?" retorted the landlord. "It's all right," remarked Maxton. "Prices vary at the diggin's, as you shall find ere long. When provisions run short, the prices become exorbitant. When plentiful, they are more moderate, but they are never low. However, men don't mind much, for most diggers have plenty of gold." Captain Bunting and Bill Jones were unable to do more than sigh out their amazement and shake their heads, as they left the ranch and mounted their steeds; in doing which the captain accidentally, as usual, drove both spurs into the sides of his mule, which caused it to execute a series of manoeuvres and pirouettes that entertained the company for a quarter of an hour, after which they rode away over the plain. It was a beautiful country through which they now ambled pleasantly. Undulating and partially wooded, with fine stretches of meadow land between, from which the scent of myriads of wild flowers rose on the cool night air. The moon sailed low in a perfectly cloudless sky, casting the shadows of the horsemen far before them as they rode, and clothing hill and dale, bush and tree, with a soft light, as if a cloud of silver gauze had settled down upon the scene. The incident in the ranche was quickly banished, and each traveller committed himself silently to the full enjoyment of the beauties around him, beauties which appeared less like reality than a vision of the night. CHAPTER 9.